Sakishima Gunto, April 1, 1945, 07:28 hours, and Lieutenant Junior Grade Seizō Yasunori pressed his Mitsubishi A-six-M Zero into a screaming dive toward the British carrier below, the 550-pound bomb beneath his fuselage promising to tear the enemy flight deck apart just as it had done to American carriers at Okinawa, completely unaware that the 3-inch armored steel waiting beneath that deck would turn his suicide dive into nothing more than a dent and a fire that British damage control crews would extinguish in 60 minutes, while American carriers burned for days under the same attack. The morning sun glinted off the Pacific as Yasunori's formation of 6 Zeros broke through scattered clouds at 8,000 feet, each pilot having written final letters to families they would never see again, each aircraft loaded with explosives meant to cripple the Allied fleet supporting the Okinawa invasion, each man convinced that his death would matter because every kamikaze attack against United States Navy carriers had proven devastatingly effective, killing hundreds and sending billion-dollar warships limping back to Pearl Harbor for 6 months of repairs or longer. Yasunori had studied the intelligence reports with grim satisfaction. The photographs of USS Franklin gutted by a single bombing run that killed 807 sailors, the images of USS Bunker Hill transformed into a floating crematorium after 2 kamikazes killed 396 men in 30 seconds. The documented proof that Japan's divine wind tactics were the only weapon left that could hurt the American colossus. But Yasunori and his fellow pilots had received no intelligence briefings about the 4 British carriers now operating as Task Force 57 off the Sakishima Islands, no warnings that His Majesty's ships Indefatigable, Formidable, Victorious, and Indomitable were designed with a fundamentally different philosophy than their American counterparts, no understanding that British naval architects had built these carriers with 3-inch thick armored flight decks specifically to survive the kind of attack Yasunori was about to deliver. The Kamikaze Corps had been born 6 months earlier in the desperate autumn of 1944, when Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stood before assembled pilots at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines and asked for volunteers to form special attack units that would crash explosive-laden aircraft into American carriers. The Admiral's voice breaking with emotion as he explained that conventional attacks no longer worked against the overwhelming American fighter screens and anti-aircraft batteries, that only the certainty of a suicide dive could guarantee a hit, that 20 pilots willing to die could achieve what 200 conventional attackers could not. The response had stunned even Onishi, hundreds of young pilots stepping forward without hesitation, some motivated by fanatical devotion to Emperor Hirohito, others by the pragmatic calculation that they were going to die anyway in this lost war, so they might as well die in a way that mattered, still others by the shame of refusing when their comrades accepted. The first organized kamikaze attack came on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when Lieutenant Yukio Seki led 5 Zeros loaded with 250-kilogram bombs against American escort carriers off Samar, Seki's aircraft slamming into USS St. Louis flight deck at 300 miles per hour and detonating the carrier's aviation fuel and ordnance in a catastrophic explosion that sent the ship to the bottom in 30 minutes, proving instantly that Onishi's terrible mathematics were correct. United States Navy carriers, for all their size and power, were fundamentally vulnerable to kamikaze attack because their flight decks were constructed of 3.5-inch wooden planks laid over 1/2-inch steel plating, a design that prioritized operational flexibility and aircraft capacity over protection, a philosophy born from pre-war assumptions that carriers would never be subjected to direct attack because their own aircraft and escorting fighters would keep enemy bombers away. Those assumptions had shattered along with St. Louis' wooden deck, and in the months that followed, kamikaze pilots discovered they could penetrate American flight decks with shocking ease. The combination of explosive payload and aircraft impact, punching through the thin protection and detonating in the hangar bays below, where dozens of fueled and armed aircraft waited like bombs themselves, the resulting explosions and fires often causing more damage than the kamikaze itself. By early 1945, the Kamikaze Corps had refined their tactics through brutal trial and error, pilots learning to approach from out of the sun or through cloud cover to avoid early detection, to dive at steep angles that made anti-aircraft tracking difficult, to aim for the intersection of flight deck and island superstructure where American carriers concentrated their command facilities and damage control stations, to release their bombs a split second before impact to ensure the explosive penetrated the deck before detonating. The results had been catastrophic for the United States Navy, with kamikaze attacks during the Philippines campaign sinking or severely damaging dozens of vessels. The attacks during the Iwo Jima operation in February 1945, forcing several carriers back to American shipyards, the massive kamikaze offensive supporting Okinawa's defense, inflicting the worst losses the United States Navy would suffer in any single campaign of the war. Intelligence officers in Tokyo compiled the damage reports with something approaching hope, calculating that if kamikaze attacks could sink or disable 3 or 4 fleet carriers per month, the American advance might be slowed enough for Japan to negotiate a conditional surrender rather than face invasion and total defeat. The mathematics of desperation suggesting that 10,000 dead pilots might save 10 million Japanese civilians from the firestorms that B-29 superfortresses were already unleashing on the home islands. What these calculations failed to account for was American industrial capacity, the ability of United States shipyards to repair battle damage that would have permanently crippled any other navy. The steady flow of replacement carriers and aircraft that meant even successful kamikaze attacks only delayed the inevitable rather than preventing it, and most critically, the calculations assumed all Allied carriers were built like American ones, a fatal error that Lieutenant Seizō Yasunori was about to discover personally. The British approach to carrier design had diverged from American philosophy in the late 1930s, when Admiralty planners concluded that Royal Navy carriers would operate in narrow waters like the Mediterranean and North Sea, where land-based aircraft posed a constant threat, making armor protection more valuable than maximum aircraft capacity, a calculation that led to the illustrious class carriers with their revolutionary armored box hangar design. The armored flight deck itself measured 3 inches of hardened steel across 62% of its length, covering the area between the 2 aircraft lifts, with the remaining sections built from 1.5-inch structural steel that still provided substantial protection. The entire armored section, weighing 1,500 tons and requiring ingenious engineering to incorporate into the ship's structure without making the carrier dangerously top-heavy. British naval architects achieved this by making the armored deck itself the ship's primary strength deck, integrating the armor into the hull's structural framework rather than adding it as supplemental protection, a technique that distributed the weight more efficiently but came with significant trade-offs. The armored box extended down the sides of the hangar bay with 4.5-inch thick vertical armor, creating a protected citadel that enclosed the ship's aircraft, fuel, and ordnance in a steel cocoon designed to contain damage rather than prevent it entirely, with armored doors at each lift well that could seal the hangar off from fire and fragmentation. The whole system designed around the assumption that British carriers would be hit, and the question was how to keep them operational afterward rather than preventing hits altogether. This design philosophy meant British carriers operated smaller air groups than their American counterparts. HMS, illustrious, initially carrying just 36 aircraft compared to the 90 to 110 aircraft aboard USS Essex-class carriers, a disparity that American officers frequently mocked as evidence of British backwardness. Jokes about limey carriers that carried more armor than airplanes circulating through Pacific Fleet ready rooms, the General consensus among United States Navy aviators being that the British had sacrificed offensive punch for defensive protection in a way that made their carriers less valuable in the carrier versus carrier battles that had defined the Pacific War. But the American mockery would evaporate in the spring of 1945 when British carriers joined the Okinawa campaign and demonstrated that their armor made them effectively immune to the kamikaze attacks that were crippling American carriers, a reversal so dramatic that Admiral Chester W. Nimitz would specifically request British carriers for high-risk operations because they could absorb punishment that would put American carriers out of action for months. The British Pacific Fleet that assembled in early 1945 represented the Royal Navy's maximum effort in the Pacific theater: 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 15 destroyers designated as Task Force 57, under the command of Vice Admiral Sir Bernard Rawlings, with Rear Admiral Sir Philip Vian commanding the carrier squadron, the force given responsibility for neutralizing Japanese airfields on the Sakishima Islands southwest of Okinawa to prevent kamikaze staging operations that could threaten the main American invasion fleet. This secondary assignment rankled some British officers who saw it as Admiral Ernest J. King's way of keeping the Royal Navy away from the glory of the main operation. But the mission would prove absolutely critical because Sakishima's airfields sat astride the direct route from Formosa to Okinawa, and controlling them meant kamikaze attacks had to take longer, more fuel-intensive routes that reduced their operational effectiveness. First contact, April 1, 1945. Task Force 57 arrived off Sakishima Gunto on March 26, 1945, and began the methodical work of suppressing the island's airfields with repeated strikes by Chance-Vought Corsair fighters and Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers, the British air groups flying from HMS Indefatigable, Indomitable, Victorious, and Illustrious in rotation to maintain continuous pressure, the strikes initially meeting little resistance as Japanese forces conserved their aircraft for kamikaze operations, rather than wasting them in defensive battles they could not win. But by April the 1st, Japanese commanders in Formosa had identified the British carriers as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Intelligence reports describing 4 large carriers operating southwest of Okinawa with what appeared to be American-style flight decks. The assessment based on visual observation from high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that could not distinguish the armored British decks from wooden American ones at 20,000 feet. The fatal assumption being that all Allied carriers were equally vulnerable to kamikaze attack. Lieutenant Yasunori's 6 aircraft formation launched from Formosa at 0600 hours on Easter Sunday morning, April 1st, carrying orders to strike the British carriers with particular emphasis on hitting between the elevators where intelligence suggested the wooden decks would be weakest. Standard kamikaze doctrine, refined through months of attacks on American carriers that had no relevance to the armored targets they were about to engage. The Zeros climbed to 8,000 feet and set course southeast, maintaining radio silence as they approached Sakishima, the pilots knowing that British and American radar could detect them from 75 miles away, but hoping that cloud cover and the confusion of ongoing air operations would mask their approach until the final dive, a tactic that had worked repeatedly against American task forces where combat air patrol fighters often became separated from the carriers they were supposed to protect. HMS Indefatigable's radar operators picked up the incoming formation at 0700 hours at a range of 60 miles, tracking the contacts as they closed at 210 knots, the fighter direction officer immediately vectoring 4 Supermarine Seafire fighters from the Combat Air Patrol to intercept, the Seafires climbing at maximum power to reach the kamikazes before they could begin their attack runs. Sub-Lieutenant R.H. Reynolds in Seafire L-3 caught the first Zero at 12,000 feet and opened fire with his 20mm Hispano cannons at high deflection the armor-piercing rounds tearing through the Zero's lightweight structure and setting the port wing ablaze. But the damaged aircraft maintained its course toward Indefatigable rather than breaking off, demonstrating the fundamental difference between conventional fighters that would evade when damaged and kamikazes that pressed attacks until destroyed or successful. Reynolds broke off to avoid a collision with his target and watched the burning Zero continue its dive, unaware that he had just witnessed the beginning of a pattern that would repeat throughout the day. Kamikaze pilots so committed to their attacks that battle damage, which would force conventional pilots to retreat, merely slowed them slightly on their final runs. A second Seafire pilot, Sub-Lieutenant John Birtle, achieved several high-deflection hits on another Zero as it looped over Indefatigable, his gun camera recording the impacts as 20mm shells struck the aircraft's fuselage and engine cowling, pieces of aluminum skin peeling away in the slipstream. But again the damaged Zero continued its attack, the pilot apparently attempting to dive directly down the carrier's funnel, a tactic that Kamikaze Doctrine recommended because it offered a path into the ship's engineering spaces if the flight deck was too heavily armored. Lieutenant Yasunori's Zero emerged from cloud cover at 3,000 feet, approximately 1 mile astern of Indefatigable, the carrier's stern presenting a perfect target as she steamed at 25 knots into the wind to recover her own strike aircraft. Dozens of sailors visible on the flight deck preparing to receive the incoming Corsairs and Avengers, the scene exactly matching the intelligence briefings that described American carriers as most vulnerable during flight operations when their decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. Yasunori pushed the stick forward and dove, simultaneously firing his two 7.7mm machine guns to suppress the carrier's anti-aircraft defenses, tracer rounds stitching across Indefatigable's flight deck and causing deck crews to scatter, though the light machine gun fire did minimal damage to the armored deck and merely alerted the carrier's gunners to the incoming threat. Indefatigable's close-range weapons opened fire when Yasunori was at 1,000 feet, multiple 40mm Bofors guns and 20mm Oerlikon cannons filling the air with explosive shells, the combined fire from the carrier and her escorting destroyers creating a wall of flak that tore into the Zero's airframe. But the Kamikaze's momentum was too great to stop, the aircraft already committed to its terminal dive, with the pilot either dead at the controls or so focused on his target that incoming fire no longer mattered. At 0728 hours, Yasunori's Zero, trailing smoke and breaking apart from battle damage, slammed into Indefatigable's flight deck at the base of the island superstructure, where the armored deck joined the unarmored forward section, the 550-pound bomb detonating on impact in a blast that sent flame and debris cascading across the deck, the explosion creating a fireball visible from miles away and prompting watching American liaison officers to prepare casualty estimates in the hundreds based on their experience with similar hits on United States Navy carriers. But HMS Indefatigable did not explode, did not burn uncontrollably, did not suffer the catastrophic secondary detonations that had gutted USS Franklin 6 weeks earlier, when a similar bomb penetrated her wooden deck, because the British carrier's 3-inch armor absorbed the blast energy in a way American carriers simply could not, the hardened steel flexing under the impact and depressing approximately 3 inches over a 15-foot area, but not fracturing, not allowing the explosion to penetrate into the hangar bay where fueled aircraft waited, the armored box design containing the damage to the flight deck level, exactly as intended. The explosion killed 14 men instantly, sailors caught in the open on the flight deck when the kamikaze struck, their bodies torn apart by blast overpressure and flying debris, the flight deck sick bay obliterated along with the pilot's briefing room, fires igniting in the superstructure where burning aviation fuel sprayed through shattered portholes. But even as flames consumed the forward island sections, Indefatigable's damage control teams were already responding with a speed and efficiency that stunned. The American observers. Lieutenant Commander W.E. Rain, United States Navy, serving as liaison officer aboard Indefatigable, had seen kamikaze damage on American carriers and expected to find the British ship crippled for weeks, if not permanently, his experience suggesting that any kamikaze hit severe enough to kill 14 men would require months of shipyard repairs, but what he witnessed instead would fundamentally change American carrier design philosophy for the remainder of the war and beyond. Damage control parties attacked the fires with foam generators and high-pressure hoses within 2 minutes of impact, the armored bulkheads preventing fire from spreading into the hangar bay, while ventilation systems evacuated smoke from the superstructure. Engineering crews immediately assessing the structural damage and determining that, while the flight deck was dented, it remained structurally sound and could support aircraft operations with minimal repair. At 0830 hours, exactly 62 minutes after the kamikaze impact, HMS Indefatigable resumed flight operations, landing the Corsairs and Avengers that had been circling overhead, waiting for the deck to clear, the pilots reporting that from the air the damage had looked catastrophic, but the carrier was somehow still operational, a scenario so alien to Pacific War experience that it took several minutes for the reality to sink in. Captain Q.D. Graham had ordered temporary wooden planking laid over the depression in the armored deck, the wood providing a smooth surface for aircraft to roll over, while structural engineers assessed whether the underlying armor needed replacement. The entire repair conducted while the ship maintained combat operations, launching combat air patrol fighters to replace those running low on fuel, the carrier's Air Intelligence Office relocating to backup spaces after their primary compartment was destroyed, the machine of war adapting and continuing without the paralysis that characterized American carrier damage control. Lieutenant Commander Rain immediately drafted a report to Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commanding the United States Fifth Fleet, describing in technical detail how the British armored deck had contained damage that would have gutted an American carrier, the report including his now famous assessment that when a kamikaze hits a United States carrier, it means 6 months of repair at Pearl Harbor. When a kamikaze hits a Limey carrier, it's just a case of sweepers, man your brooms. The phrase capturing both the dramatic difference in survivability and Rain's grudging respect for a design philosophy he had previously dismissed as overly conservative. The report reached Spruance within hours and was immediately forwarded to Admiral Nimitz at Pacific Fleet Headquarters. The implications obvious even to officers who had spent years advocating for maximum aircraft capacity over armor protection, because if British carriers could absorb kamikaze hits and remain operational while American carriers burned for days. The strategic calculus of the Okinawa campaign and the planned invasion of Japan would need fundamental revision. The Japanese High Command in Formosa received wildly inaccurate reports of the April 1st attack on HMS Indefatigable reconnaissance aircraft, observing the initial explosion and reporting the carrier heavily damaged and likely sinking, the assessment based on the assumption that any direct kamikaze hit would produce catastrophic results. Intelligence officers in Taipei filing reports that claimed one British carrier destroyed with high confidence. The Phantom victory celebrated as proof that Allied carriers, regardless of nationality, remained vulnerable to divine wind attacks. This fundamental misunderstanding would persist for weeks because Japanese reconnaissance aircraft could observe kamikaze impacts but could not remain in the area long enough to assess actual damage, the pilots seeing explosions and fires and reasonably concluding the targets were doomed, unaware that British damage control was extinguishing those fires and patching those holes, while American carriers would have been fighting for survival under the same conditions. By early May 1945, Task Force 57 had been at sea almost continuously for 6 weeks, the prolonged operations taking a toll on both equipment and personnel. HMS, illustrious developing machinery problems that forced her withdrawal to Sydney for repairs, leaving Indefatigable, Victorious, Formidable, and Indomitable to continue the grinding work of suppressing Sakishima's airfields, the carriers operating in a cycle of 2 days, striking, followed by 2 days refueling and replenishing from the British Pacific Fleet's logistics train, a pattern that was sustainable but exhausting for flight crews who flew multiple sorties per day in deteriorating weather conditions. HMS Formidable, a 23,000-ton illustrious class carrier commissioned in 1940, had already survived multiple bomb hits in the Mediterranean, including a devastating attack off Crete that would have sunk a less well-protected ship, Captain Philip Ruck Keene, commanding a crew of 1,792, who had learned through hard experience that their armored carrier could take punishment that would destroy conventional warships, that confidence about to be tested again in the most dramatic way possible. May 4, 1945, dawned clear over Sakishima Gunto, the weather finally cooperating after days of rain and low clouds that had limited air operations. Task Force 57 launching morning strikes against the airfields at Ishigaki and Miyako, while maintaining heavy combat air patrols to protect against the kamikaze attacks that had become increasingly frequent as Japanese commanders recognized the British carriers as a critical threat to their Okinawa support operations. At 0930 hours, Formidable's radar detected a single contact at long range approaching from the northwest at low altitude, the lone aircraft initially assessed as possibly friendly because it was not part of a larger formation, but fighter direction officers vectored HMS Victorious's Corsair fighters toward the contact as a precaution, standard procedure being to intercept any unidentified aircraft before it could threaten the task force. The contact turned out to be a Mitsubishi A-6-M Zero carrying a 250-kilogram bomb, the pilot having flown from Formosa alone rather than in formation, possibly a deliberate tactic to avoid early detection, or perhaps simply the result of other aircraft in his unit experiencing mechanical problems that forced them to abort, whatever the reason. The lone kamikaze had penetrated Task Force 57's outer defense zone and was now diving toward the carriers from 3,000 feet. Formidable's close-range weapons engaged at 1,000 yards, 40mm Bofors guns sending streams of explosive shells toward the diving Zero, the gunners tracking the target manually because the attack angle was too steep for the radar-directed systems, multiple hits observed on the kamikaze's wings and fuselage, but the aircraft continuing its dive, the pilot either already dead or determined to complete his mission regardless of damage. The fatalistic dedication that made kamikazes so difficult to stop even when gunners achieved what would normally be killing hits. At 0950 hours, the Zero struck Formidable's armored flight deck approximately 40 feet from the island superstructure, the impact point nearly identical to where Indefatigable had been hit a month earlier. The 250-kilogram bomb detonating a fraction of a second before impact and creating a massive explosion that tore a 2-foot square hole through the 3-inch armor plating, fragments of the bomb and aircraft spraying across the flight deck and into the island structure, burning aviation fuel, washing over the deck and flowing into ventilation trunks. The blast and fire killing 8 men immediately and wounding 51 others, among the dead 2 officers in the Air Intelligence Office who had been coordinating strike operations when bomb fragments tore through the bulkhead and shredded them. The explosion depressed the armored deck over a 24 by 20-foot area, the hardened steel flexing under the blast but maintaining structural integrity, though the hole punched by the bomb represented the only time during the entire Pacific campaign that a kamikaze would actually penetrate a British armored deck, a testament to both the severity of the attack and the fundamental soundness of the armored box design that even this penetration did not cause catastrophic damage. Burning fuel from the Zero cascaded into the hangar bay through the bomb hole, igniting a Corsair fighter that was being serviced, the flaming aircraft threatening to trigger a chain reaction among the other Aircraft in the hangar. But Formidable's damage control teams had trained for exactly this scenario, foam generators immediately smothering the burning Corsair, while firefighters attacked the flight deck blaze with high-pressure water, the armored hangar doors sealing off different sections to prevent fire spread, the integrated damage control system responding with mechanical precision even as men died in the flames. Captain Philip Ruck Keene stood on Formidable's bridge watching the damage control efforts with his United States Navy liaison officer, Lieutenant Commander Benjamin Van D. Hedges, the American officer visibly shaken because he had seen identical kamikaze hits on United States carriers produce vastly different results. USS Franklin's hangar bay exploding in a fireball that killed 724 men when a kamikaze penetrated her wooden deck, USS Bunker Hill transformed into a burning wreck when 2 kamikazes struck within 30 seconds, Hedges expecting Formidable to suffer similar catastrophic damage, and instead watching British sailors extinguish fires and patch holes with a speed that seemed impossible. Ruck Keene turned to Hedges, gripped the American's arm, and, according to multiple witness accounts, asked in a voice like a foghorn in the mating season, "What do you think of our bloody British flight decks now?" The rhetorical question, capturing the vindication felt by Royal Navy officers who had endured years of American criticism about their armored carriers' smaller air groups. The proof that their design philosophy had been correct all along, literally burning on the deck beneath their feet. Formidable's damage control teams extinguished all fires by 11:55 hours, approximately 2 hours after the kamikaze impact. And while the carrier could not immediately resume flight operations due to the hole in the flight deck, repair crews had fabricated a temporary patch using wood planking and concrete, covered with thin steel plates, tack welded in place by 1700 hours. That same day, the entire repair from kamikaze impact to resuming flight operations completed in less than 8 hours, a time frame that would have been impossible for an American carrier suffering similar damage. Lieutenant Commander Hedges incorporated this observation into his official report, noting that without armored decks, Task Force 57 would have been out of action with all 4 carriers requiring months of repair, the mathematical reality being that the British armored design had effectively quadrupled Allied carrier availability in the critical Sakishima interdiction mission. By mid-May 1945, Japanese intelligence had finally begun to recognize that British carriers were surviving kamikaze attacks that should have crippled them. Reconnaissance reports noting that carriers identified as heavily damaged days earlier were back in action, launching strikes, the pattern inconsistent with previous experience attacking. American carriers where successful kamikaze hits invariably resulted in weeks or months of repairs, but Japanese analysts struggled to understand why this difference existed, some theorizing that British damage control was superior, others suggesting that reconnaissance aircraft were overestimating damage severity, very few considering that the carriers themselves might be fundamentally different from American designs. The failure to grasp the reality of British armor would lead to continued kamikaze attacks on Task Force 57 throughout May. Japanese commanders committing precious aircraft and pilots to strikes that might inconvenience British carriers for hours rather than disabling them for months, a strategic misallocation of resources that would have been obvious if Imperial Japanese Navy intelligence had properly analyzed the accumulated evidence. On May 9, 1945, Japanese commanders in Formosa launched a coordinated kamikaze attack against Task Force 57, 4 Zeros loaded with bombs departing at dawn with orders to concentrate on the 2 northernmost carriers in the British formation, intelligence having identified these as HMS Victorious and Formidable, both illustrious class vessels with identical armor protection, the attack plan calling for simultaneous strikes from different angles to saturate the carrier's anti-aircraft defenses and guarantee at least some kamikazes reach their targets. HMS Victorious detected the incoming formation at 60 miles range at 14:47 hours. Fighter direction officers immediately launching additional Seafires from Combat Air Patrol to intercept, but the kamikazes were approaching at wave-top height to avoid radar detection until the last moment, then climbing sharply to 3,000 feet for their terminal dives, a tactic that compressed the intercept window and made it difficult for defending fighters to reach attack position before the kamikazes began their runs. The first Zero targeted Victorious from astern, diving through moderate anti-aircraft fire and striking the carrier's flight deck aft at 15:05 hours, the 250-kilogram bomb detonating on impact and creating a blast that destroyed the ship's single aircraft catapult and knocked out several anti-aircraft gun mounts. But the armored deck absorbed the explosion without fracturing, the bomb's energy dissipating across the hardened steel rather than penetrating into the hangar, fires igniting on the flight deck and in the catapult machinery, but contained by damage control teams within 30 minutes. A second Zero approached Victorious almost immediately after the first impact, the pilot seeing his leader strike and assuming the carrier was already crippled, but Captain Michael M. Denny ordered hard rudder to starboard as the kamikaze committed to its dive, the unexpected turn causing the Zero to miss the island and instead crash into the aft deck park where corsairs were spotted for launch, the kamikaze's bomb exploding among the parked aircraft and destroying several, but the aircraft themselves were positioned on the armored deck rather than in the vulnerable hangar. So the secondary explosions, while spectacular, did minimal structural damage, burning wreckage simply pushed over the side by deck crews using tractors, the carrier's armored structure completely unaffected. Task Force 57's anti-aircraft gunners splashed the third kamikaze before it could begin its attack dive, concentrated fire from multiple ships disintegrating the Zero at 2,000 feet, but the fourth kamikaze broke through the defensive fire and targeted HMS Formidable, the same carrier that had been hit just 5 days earlier, the pilot apparently selecting the already damaged vessel as the most promising target, diving from the starboard quarter and aiming for the patch section of deck where the May 4th kamikaze had punched through. At 15:20 hours, the Zero slammed into Formidable's flight deck approximately 10 yards aft of the previous impact point, the 250-kilogram bomb detonating and creating another massive explosion that killed the petty officer gunlayer of a nearby pom-pom mount when an aircraft wheel from the disintegrating Zero decapitated him. But this time, the bomb failed to penetrate the armored deck, exploding instead on the surface and creating a shallow crater rather than the deep hole that the May 4th attack had achieved. The difference possibly due to the bomb detonating slightly earlier or the deck armor being thicker at this particular point. The explosion destroyed 18 Corsair fighters parked on the deck, the aircraft loaded with fuel and ammunition for upcoming strikes, the burning aircraft representing a significant loss of offensive capability and requiring Formidable to draw replacement aircraft from the fleet train's reserve. But again, the armored structure prevented catastrophic damage, fires extinguished within 40 minutes, temporary patches installed over the deck crater, flight operations resuming by evening, the carrier demonstrating yet again that British armored design could absorb punishment that would cripple American vessels. The contrast between British armored carriers' survival and American carriers' vulnerability reached its starkest expression when comparing Task Force 57's experience with the catastrophic damage suffered by USS Franklin and USS Bunker Hill during the same Okinawa campaign, both American carriers struck by attacks similar to those that merely inconvenienced British carriers, both transformed into floating charnel houses where hundreds died in fires that raged for hours or days. The fundamental design difference between armored and unarmored flight decks illustrated in the most brutal way possible. USS Franklin, an Essex-class fleet carrier displacing 27,100 tons and carrying an air group of 90 aircraft, had been operating closer to the Japanese home islands than any American carrier had yet ventured, launching strikes against airfields on Kyushu and Honshu in direct support of the Okinawa landings. Captain Leslie E. Garris, commanding a crew of 3,193, who believed their carrier's size and modern anti-aircraft suite made them reasonably safe from Japanese attack. On March 19, 1945, at 0708 hours, a single Japanese Yokosuka D-4Y Suisei dive bomber, called Judy by Allied intelligence, penetrated Franklin's combat air patrol by hiding in cloud cover, the pilot releasing two 550-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs from low altitude before American fighters could intercept, the bombs striking Franklin's wooden flight deck and punching through the 3.5-inch planking and half-inch steel plating as if it were paper, one bomb detonating on the hangar deck among 31 fueled and armed aircraft awaiting launch, the other penetrating to the second deck and exploding near ammunition magazines. The initial explosions killed dozens instantly, but the real horror began when the hangar deck fire spread to the flight deck where additional aircraft were parked, Tiny Tim air-to-surface rockets cooking off in the heat and streaking across the carrier like missiles, 500-pound bombs detonating and blowing holes in the wooden deck, aviation fuel flowing through ventilation ducts and igniting fires on multiple decks simultaneously, the wooden flight deck burning like kindling and contributing fuel to fires rather than containing them, every design decision that prioritized operational flexibility over protection now revealed as potentially fatal. Within 15 minutes of the initial bomb impacts, USS Franklin was dead in the water with a 13-degree list, all electrical power lost, radio communications severed, massive fires raging from the hangar deck to the bridge. The carrier transformed from a functioning warship to a floating disaster area in less time than it took British carriers to extinguish kamikaze fires. The fundamental difference being that Franklin's unarmored design allowed bombs to penetrate deep into the ship before exploding, while British armored decks contained similar weapons at the surface. Captain Garris faced a decision that no British carrier commander had to contemplate during the Pacific campaign, whether to abandon ship and save the crew or fight the fires and risk additional deaths, because Franklin's damage was so extensive and spreading so rapidly that conventional damage control seemed futile. But Garris ordered the crew to fight on. The 106 officers and 604 enlisted men who remained aboard when hundreds of others had been blown overboard or driven off by flames, becoming heroes whose desperate efforts over the next 30 hours would save their ship. The casualty figures from USS Franklin tell a story of unprecedented devastation, official statistics recording 807 killed and at least 487 wounded, though some sources cite 724 dead and 265 wounded depending on whether air group personnel and Marines in transit are included, either count representing the highest casualties suffered by any United States Navy ship that survived the war, the death toll exceeding that of many vessels that actually sank, a grim testament to how vulnerable unarmored carriers were to internal explosions. Franklin would eventually reach New York under her own power after emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor, the carrier's transit across the Pacific and through the Panama Canal becoming a tale of remarkable seamanship and damage control. But the ship would never operate aircraft again, too extensively damaged for economical repair, given that the war was clearly ending. Franklin and Bunker Hill, the only Essex-class carriers that never returned to active service after World War II, both rendered permanently hors de combat by attacks that British armored carriers survived and recovered from in hours. USS Bunker Hill's destruction on May 11, 1945, followed a similar pattern, but with the additional horror of two kamikaze strikes within 30 seconds. The first aircraft penetrating Bunker Hill's flight deck and exploding among parked aircraft, the second striking the island's superstructure and destroying ready rooms where air group officers were planning strikes, both kamikazes carrying 250-kilogram bombs identical to those that had failed to seriously damage British carriers. But against Bunker Hill's wooden deck, the weapons proved devastatingly effective. The kamikaze that struck Bunker Hill's flight deck aft created a fireball that swept across the deck and into the hangar bay through the unarmored flight deck, igniting 30 aircraft parked on the flight deck and 48 more in the hangar, all fueled and armed for strikes. The resulting explosions and fires, killing 346 men, including 43 who were never found, their bodies consumed in fires so intense that aluminum aircraft structures melted. The ship's forward elevator blown completely off its mounts by a secondary explosion and hurled hundreds of feet in the air, visible in photographs as a dark rectangle at the top of the explosion plume. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58 from Bunker Hill, lost 13 of his staff officers in the attack, his flag cabin destroyed, along with all personal papers and uniforms. The admiral forced to transfer to USS Enterprise via Breach's Buoy while fires still raged. The image of the Fifth Fleet's carrier commander fleeing his burning flagship encapsulating how completely kamikazes had upended American carrier doctrine. Bunker Hill fought fires for 11 hours before bringing them under control. The carrier's survival owed more to luck and the crew's desperate efforts than any inherent protection in the ship's design, because if either kamikaze had struck slightly differently, or if one more bomb had cooked off near a magazine, Bunker Hill would have joined the carriers that sank rather than those that limped home. The margin between survival and destruction measured in feet and seconds when carriers lacked armor protection. By late May 1945, fragmentary reports filtering back to Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo began painting a troubling picture of the British Pacific Fleet's resilience. Reconnaissance pilots describing carriers that appeared heavily damaged in one mission report somehow back in action during the next mission. The temporal impossibility of repairing such damage in the field forcing intelligence analysts to reconsider their assumptions about British carrier construction. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the naval aviator who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and now served in a planning role, reviewed the accumulating evidence with growing concern, calculating that kamikaze pilots were achieving hit rates against British carriers comparable to those against American vessels, approximately 1 successful strike per 7 sorties, but the British carriers were returning to operations in hours or days, while American carriers required months, suggesting some fundamental difference in either damage control, capability, or ship design that Japanese intelligence had failed to identify. The truth emerged gradually through multiple sources. German naval attachés in Tokyo reporting that British carriers incorporated heavy armor protection based on European war experience, captured Royal Navy documents describing the illustrious class design philosophy, even American radio communications intercepted by Japanese signal intelligence inadvertently revealing the armored deck's existence when United States Navy officers discussed British carrier survivability, the pieces of the puzzle finally forming a complete picture that shocked Japanese naval commanders. The realization that British carriers had 3-inch armored flight decks came too late to alter Japanese strategy, kamikaze operations against Task Force 57 continuing through May and into June because no alternative tactics existed, conventional bombing having proven even less effective than suicide attacks. But the knowledge that armor could defeat kamikaze strikes prompted urgent reassessment of Japan's own carrier programs, the incomplete carrier Shinano having been converted to an armored deck design before her sinking, the proposed G-15 class supercarriers planned with British-style armor protection, though none would be completed before Japan's surrender. More immediately, the armor revelation forced Japanese commanders to confront an uncomfortable strategic reality that kamikaze attacks, for all their dramatic impact and terrible cost in pilot lives, were not actually winning the war. American industrial capacity replacing damaged carriers faster than kamikazes could sink them, and now British armored carriers had demonstrated that proper protection could reduce kamikaze effectiveness to mere nuisance level, temporary flight deck closures rather than months-long repairs, the divine wind proving to be a storm that could be weathered rather than the war-winning weapon Tokyo had desperately needed. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet responsible for kamikaze operations, recorded in his diary his frustration at intelligence failures that had led to wasted attacks on British carriers, writing that, had we known the enemy possessed armored carriers, we would have concentrated our remaining strength against the thin-skinned American vessels exclusively, but this intelligence reached us only after hundreds of pilots had died striking targets that could not be seriously damaged. The admission, revealing both tactical flexibility and strategic despair, because focusing on American carriers would not change the fundamental mathematics that Japan was losing, and suicide tactics merely delayed the inevitable. Task Force 57 completed its Sakishima Gunto operations on May 25, 1945, withdrawing to Leyte for replenishment after 2 months of continuous combat operations, during which all 4 British carriers had been hit by kamikazes at least once. Formidable struck twice, the accumulated damage adding up to a total of 62 killed across all vessels, a casualty figure that would have been considered remarkably light for a single American carrier struck once, the mathematical comparison demonstrating armor's value in the starkest possible terms. British carriers, with 1/6 the air group capacity suffering 1/10 the casualties while operating in the same threat environment as American carriers that were being devastated. The operational impact proved equally dramatic. United States Navy carriers hit by kamikazes during the Okinawa campaign averaged 173 days out of action for repairs according to post-war analysis, while British armored carriers averaged 8 hours, a difference of 5,184% in availability, meaning a single British armored carrier provided more operational days than 20 American carriers of similar size would have provided under the same attack intensity, a force multiplication that completely justified the reduced air group capacity. Admiral Spruance's official after-action report for the Okinawa campaign included specific recommendations that all future American carriers incorporate armored flight decks based on British experience, writing that the ability of British armored carriers to survive multiple kamikaze strikes while maintaining operations has demonstrated conclusively that armor protection is worth the reduction in aircraft capacity, particularly when operating within range of land-based air power, the assessment representing a complete reversal of pre-war American carrier doctrine that had dismissed armor as unnecessary weight. The Midway-class carriers, already under construction when the Okinawa campaign began, were immediately redesigned to incorporate armored flight decks, the modification adding thousands of tons of displacement and reducing aircraft capacity from 137 to 120 aircraft. But planners now considered this trade-off acceptable given what British carriers had demonstrated, the redesign adding months to construction schedules, but ensuring the Midway class would be able to survive the kamikaze threat that was expected to intensify during Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. British armored carrier experience influenced not just American designs, but also post-war Soviet and French carrier programs, both nations incorporating heavy armor protection in their first post-war carriers. The global acceptance of armored flight decks representing vindication for British designers who had been derided as conservative and backward during the war's early years, when carrier versus carrier battles made aircraft capacity seem more valuable than protection. The human cost comparison between armored and unarmored carriers during the Okinawa campaign tells an even more compelling story. United States Navy carriers suffering 4,900 killed and 4,820, 4 wounded from kamikaze attacks, while British carriers in the same campaign recorded 82 total British personnel killed, including those lost to operational accidents unrelated to kamikaze attacks, the tenfold difference in casualties occurring despite British carriers operating for similar durations in the same threat environment, the lives saved by armor protection numbering in the thousands when extrapolated across the campaign. The physics of why British armored carriers survived kamikaze strikes that destroyed American carriers involved multiple interconnected factors beyond simple deck thickness, though the 3-inch hardened steel certainly played the primary role by preventing bomb penetration that was the root cause of catastrophic American carrier damage. When a kamikaze carrying a 250-kilogram bomb struck an American carrier's wooden flight deck at 300 miles per hour, the aircraft's mass and velocity allowed the bomb to punch through the 3.5-inch wood planking and 1/2-inch steel plating before detonating, the explosion occurring inside the ship where it could ignite aviation fuel and ordnance in the hangar bay, trigger secondary explosions, and spread fire through ventilation systems to multiple decks, the unarmored design essentially allowing the weapon to explode in the most dangerous possible location. British armored decks, by contrast, forced the same weapon to detonate on the deck surface, the 3-inch armor absorbing blast energy through deformation, rather than fracturing, the explosion's force dissipating into the open air above the deck rather than being channeled into the ship's interior, fires starting on the exposed flight deck where they could be fought effectively rather than in the enclosed hangar where they could spread rapidly. The armored box hangar design provided a second layer of protection even when bombs penetrated the flight deck, as occurred once to Formidable on May 4th, the 4.5-inch vertical armor around the hangar, preventing blast and fragmentation from reaching critical machinery spaces and magazines, while armored doors at each aircraft lift allowed damage control teams to seal off sections of the hangar and contain fires, preventing the ship-wide conflagrations that consumed American carriers. British damage control doctrine also contributed significantly to armored carrier survivability, Royal Navy training emphasizing containment over suppression, accepting that fires would occur but focusing on preventing their spread rather than immediately attacking flames, a philosophy enabled by the armored structure that gave damage control teams time to establish boundaries before fires spread beyond control, while American doctrine emphasized aggressive firefighting that worked well for external fires, but proved less effective when fires started in the hangar and spread too quickly for crews to contain. The closed hangar design of British carriers, criticized by Americans as reducing operational efficiency by requiring all aircraft to be struck below before flight operations could begin, proved invaluable during kamikaze attacks because it meant fewer aircraft were exposed on the flight deck when strikes occurred, and those aircraft that were on deck could be pushed over the side if burning rather than threatening to detonate in place, while American carriers typically parked dozens of aircraft on deck to maximize capacity, those aircraft becoming additional fuel for fires when kamikazes struck. Material choices further differentiated British and American carriers' fire resistance, British carriers using extensive asbestos insulation and fire-resistant paint throughout their superstructures, these materials containing fires more effectively than the traditional Navy paint and minimal insulation used on American vessels. Though the long-term health consequences of asbestos exposure would only become apparent decades later, the wartime priority being fire resistance rather than crew health. The British armored carrier concept achieved ultimate vindication in October 1945 when the United States Navy formally adopted armored flight deck construction for all future carriers. The Bureau of Ships directive citing Task Force 57's experience as conclusive proof that armor protection justified reduced aircraft capacity, particularly for carriers expected to operate within range of land-based air power. The policy reversal representing one of the few times in military history That actual combat experience completely overturned established doctrine within months rather than years. United States Strategic Bombing Survey analysts studying kamikaze effectiveness noted that British armored carriers had sustained an average of 1 kamikaze hit per carrier during the Okinawa campaign, with an average 8.4 hours out of action, while American carriers sustained an average of 1.2 kamikaze hits per carrier, with an average 173 days out of action, the 48-fold difference in downtime, demonstrating that armor was by far the most effective counter to kamikaze attacks, more valuable than improved combat air patrols, better radar, or enhanced anti-aircraft armament. The statistical analysis extended to cost-effectiveness, calculating that a British armored carrier costing approximately £12 million provided more operational availability under kamikaze attack than 4 American carriers, costing a combined $160 million. The armor essentially quadrupling force effectiveness at one-third the total cost when operating in high-threat environments, a ratio that would have been even more favorable if the analysis included crew casualty costs and the strategic value of experienced personnel who survived aboard armored carriers but died aboard unarmored ones. British naval architects who had designed the illustrious class in the late 1930s received formal recognition from multiple Allied governments for their prescient emphasis on protection over capacity, the designers having correctly anticipated that carriers would face sustained attack from land-based aircraft and that armor would prove essential for survival. Though their original threat assessments had focused on European theater operations against German and Italian air forces rather than Pacific operations against Japanese kamikazes, the fundamental principle of armored protection proving valid regardless of the specific threat. The Royal Navy's decision to accept smaller air groups in exchange for heavy armor protection, controversial throughout the war and the subject of endless criticism from American officers who saw the reduced aircraft capacity as evidence of British naval decline, was now recognized as a sophisticated design choice that reflected realistic assessment of carrier vulnerability. The British having understood from the beginning what Americans learned painfully in 1945, that a carrier sunk or crippled by bomb damage generates 0 offensive sorties regardless of how many aircraft it would have carried if undamaged, making protection a prerequisite for sustained operations rather than a luxury that reduced effectiveness. This recognition led to formal United States Navy delegations visiting British shipyards to study armored carrier construction techniques. American naval architects examining how British designers had integrated 3-inch flight deck armor into the ship's structure without creating instability, learning the welding techniques and structural supports necessary to carry such weight high in the ship, acquiring expertise that would be applied to the Midway-class carriers and influence American carrier design for the remainder of the century. Though German and Italian naval forces played minimal direct roles in Pacific operations by 1945, both Axis powers maintained naval attachés in Tokyo who observed Allied operations through Japanese intelligence reports and drew lessons for their own abortive carrier programs. The German observer reports proving particularly detailed because Kriegsmarine interest in carrier operations remained high despite the failure to complete any German carriers during the war, while Italian observers focused more on cruiser and destroyer operations, but nevertheless noted the British armored carrier success with professional interest. Kapitän zur See Paul Weniker, German naval attaché in Tokyo from 1940 to 1945, compiled extensive reports on kamikaze operations based on Japanese briefings and intercepts of Allied communications. His May 1945 report to Berlin, noting with evident surprise that British carriers operating off Sakishima have demonstrated remarkable resilience to Japanese special attack aircraft, sustaining multiple direct hits, yet remaining operational within hours, suggesting armor protection far heavier than intelligence estimates indicated, the assessment accurate, though Venaker lacked specific details about British armored deck construction because Japanese intelligence itself only gradually pieced together the full picture. Venaker's reports drew explicit comparisons to the abandoned German carrier Graf Zeppelin, which had been designed with a 1.5-inch armored flight deck, thinner than British armor but substantially heavier than American carriers, the German design reflecting similar European theater assumptions about carrier vulnerability to land-based air attack, though Graf Zeppelin's incomplete status meant these design choices were never tested in combat. The carrier scuttled in 1945 without ever launching an aircraft. Italian naval observers operating from their embassy in Tokyo through 1943 until Italy's surrender, and then continuing in reduced capacity as the Italian Social Republic maintained nominal diplomatic presence, focused primarily on documenting Japanese submarine and surface operations, but could not ignore the kamikaze phenomenon that dominated Pacific naval warfare by 1945, Capitano di Vascello Luigi Sansonetti. Filing reports that noted British carriers' survival suggested fundamental differences in construction philosophy between Anglo-Saxon navies, with British emphasis on protection proving advantageous under sustained air attack, while American emphasis on aircraft capacity creates vulnerability that Japanese exploit ruthlessly. The observation astute, though Sansonetti lacked technical specifications to understand exactly how British armor functioned. Both German and Italian observers drew similar conclusions from British armored carrier experience, that European naval tradition, emphasizing protection and survivability, had proven more suitable for modern carrier warfare than American tradition, emphasizing maximum offensive punch, though both acknowledged that American industrial capacity allowed the United States Navy to absorb losses that would cripple any other navy, making armor somewhat less critical for American operations than for British ones. The strategic difference being that Britain fielded 4 armored carriers in the Pacific, while America fielded 40 unarmored ones, allowing Americans to tolerate individual carrier losses that Britain could not afford. The last kamikaze attack on Task Force 57 occurred on August 9, 1945, mere days before Japan's surrender, a lone Zero striking HMS Indefatigable and causing minor damage that was repaired within 3 hours. The attack almost perfunctory, as if the pilot understood his death would achieve nothing but felt obligated to fulfill his mission, regardless. The futility of kamikaze operations against British armored carriers having become apparent to everyone, including the Japanese commanders ordering the strikes. By war's end, British Pacific Fleet carriers had sustained a total of 11 direct kamikaze hits during operations from March through August 1945, with an additional 32 aircraft destroyed by kamikaze-related fires and fragments. Total personnel casualties of 82 killed across all causes including operational accidents, while American carriers in the same theater during the same period sustained 36 direct kamikaze hits with 4,900 killed and 4,824 wounded. The disparity so extreme that statistical analysis could not explain it through operational differences or chance, leaving British armored construction as the only variable that accounted for the 5,000% difference in casualty rates. Admiral Bruce Fraser, Commander-in-Chief of the British Pacific Fleet, submitted his final report to the Admiralty in September 1945 with a section specifically addressing armored carrier effectiveness, writing that the decision made in 1936 to armor our carrier flight decks has been vindicated beyond any doubt. British carriers operating in conditions identical to those faced by American carriers sustained a fraction of the damage and casualties, remaining operational when American carriers would have been crippled or destroyed, the armor proving worth far more than the aircraft capacity sacrificed to accommodate it. The assessment representing official recognition of a design choice that had been controversial for nearly a decade. Japanese post-war analysis conducted during the occupation reached similar conclusions from the opposite perspective. Former Imperial Japanese Navy officers interviewed by United States Strategic Bombing Survey teams acknowledging that kamikaze attacks had proven ineffective against British armored carriers. Admiral Soemu Toyota, former Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, stating in his 1946 interrogation that "We did not understand that British carriers were armored until late in the Okinawa campaign, by which time we had wasted hundreds of aircraft and pilots attacking targets that could not be seriously damaged. Had we known earlier, we would have concentrated solely on American carriers which were vulnerable." The admission revealing both tactical ignorance and strategic desperation, because even concentrating on American carriers would not have changed Japan's inevitable defeat, only possibly delayed it slightly. The kamikaze pilots who died attacking British armored carriers achieved literally nothing, their sacrifices failing to even temporarily disable their targets in most cases. The strategic futility of suicide tactics when employed against properly protected warships demonstrated conclusively, though this lesson would be forgotten by later generations who romanticized kamikaze attacks as examples of warrior spirit rather than recognizing them as desperate measures that failed to achieve strategic objectives. The British armored carrier experience in the Pacific provided the final, definitive answer to a debate that had consumed naval architects for 2 decades, whether carriers needed armor protection or whether aircraft capacity and operational flexibility were more valuable. Combat proving that carriers which could survive damage generated far more operational value than carriers which could carry more aircraft but were vulnerable to disabling hits. The mathematical certainty being that a carrier sunk or crippled provides 0 sorties regardless of its theoretical aircraft capacity, making protection the foundation upon which all other capabilities must be built. A lesson learned at terrible cost by American sailors who died by the thousands aboard unarmored carriers, while their British counterparts survived kamikaze strikes in armored vessels that were dismissed as obsolete until combat revealed them as prescient.